The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, we're going to give the rest of the attendees just another minute or so to join and then we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Sherman and I coordinate the Mental Health Awareness Training Grant. I get the honor of introducing you to Sherry Wallace. She is the project coordinator for the System of Care Community for Early Signs and Symptoms grant that is through Burrell Behavioral Health. And she'll be sharing with us today about the early signs of psychosis. So really excited for her to share this information with us. If you wouldn't mind asking questions throughout the webinar, that would be great. We will go ahead and address those questions at the end, but feel free to ask them throughout as well. And now I'm just going to hand it over to Sherry.
Hi, welcome everybody to Improving Youth Outcomes and Understanding the At-Risk Mental State and Ultra-High Risk of Psychosis. Like Sam said, my name is Sherry Wallace, and I am the project coordinator for Burrell, which is part of the System of Care for the Community for Early Signs and Symptoms staff. And so in coordination with that staff, we put this together for you guys. The System of Care is actually a grant that was developed by SAMHSA. It's mothered by the Department of Mental Health and piloted by 3 different sites in the state of Missouri. We were told when they came for our site visit in August that this is the first System of Care grant that's ever focused in the nation on this particular population and this particular age group. So some things to know about our grant is that we focus on youth that are ages 9 to 17. Typically, all the research that's been done previous to this has been for youth 16 up. And so we're pretty excited about the information that we've been able to gain. Previously, youth were subject that were 9 to 16 were subject to inadequate surveillance, screening, and early identification and treatment. In the next year, because we're in year 3 out of 4 years, we hope to take all of the information that we've gained and push that model out, not just statewide, but nationwide. Our grant goals have included enhancing surveillance, monitoring, early identification, treatment of youth experiencing an at-risk mental state or who have an increased risk of psychosis. We hope to enhance already existing services by creating opportunities for interventions for younger youth. So like I said, we're looking at ages 9 to 17, which is younger than we've ever looked before for this particular population. We want to promote active outreach, engagement, support leadership and mentoring of these youth and their families in order to promote better life outcomes. And we also were hoping to fill any gaps for specialized services by adding some additional evidence-based or evidence-informed practices, including targeted psychosocial, individual, group, and family interventions. So far, our grant has actually served 977 screenings. We refer 25% of those for further services, and we have 223 youth currently engaged in services between those 3 sites. I want to start by talking a little bit about cultural competent care. We reduce stigma by being culturally competent, and we know that, at least in our area, that stigma is something that creates a big barrier and why people don't want to talk about psychosis in particular. And so let's talk about a couple of definitions. What is culture? Culture is characteristic features that are shared by a group. They're shared attitudes, beliefs, customs, values, goals, behaviors, and practices. And we could continue with that definition quite a while if we wanted to get into a lot of details about what culture is. So then what is cultural competence? Because that's a little bit different. It's the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems that are different from your own. And so why is this important? Well, we've learned that if we're culturally competent, we are better able to eliminate racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities, both in health and mental health care. And so we want to make sure that the playing field is equal for all those involved and that we are treating them in the very best manner that we can. So I almost got ahead of myself. I apologize. Self-assessment and self-awareness are important for us to be aware of how we are working with individuals. We look at implicit bias, blind spots, and microaggressions. An implicit bias is a relatively unconscious and automatic feature of prejudice or judgment in social behavior. An example would be a member of an underrepresented group making a point in a seminar, for example, only to be ignored, but then another person making that same point a little later, only to be applauded for their insight. Or for example, if I were speaking to you in person and I were to fail to notice someone, but then later call on members of an underrepresented group, that also would be an implicit bias. Blind spots are hidden biases that we want to be aware of, because those are little bits of knowledge that kind of influence our behavior and how we treat other people. A microaggression is a statement, an action, or an incident regarded as unintentional. It's an unintentional discrimination which may be based on a socioeconomic status, a disability. It could be based on gender, gender expression, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. An example of a microaggression, for example, could be disregarding religious or cultural traditions or their details. And not being aware of what those are is still a microaggression. We could also, another example of a microaggression could be setting a low expectation for individuals from particular groups. So if you know that there's a lower socioeconomic status in a certain neighborhood and you didn't expect as much from them as you maybe did from a wealthier neighborhood, that would be an example of a microaggression. But the truth is, each of us are a result of the experiences we have had and lived through. Both our past and lived experience influence our vision and how we see the world. The very best way to know what is going on is to self-assess. And with every human we engage with, we need to understand the cultures being plural because we have lots of different cultures in each one of us that each human comes from. How do you know what their cultures are? You ask respectfully. We don't assume that we know anyone's cultures. With every behavior we observe, encounter, or assess, we need to consider the cultural factors that might be involved. So about now, I want to talk about the concept that people think that they're not implicitly biased. And those studies have shown that everyone is implicitly biased, whether we want to be or not. A study that was done in 2007 indicated that participants' self-conceptions as being objective actually increase their likelihood of exhibiting gender bias during a hiring evaluation task. So just the mere fact of being reminded of how objective you think you are actually made them more gender biased in this particular study that was done by Cohen in 2007. In Ponen, Lynn, and Ross's 2013 study, they noted that people were better able to detect implicit biases in other people than themselves. Well, now who thought that we're able to recognize something in somebody else better than in ourselves? But they already knew that. 2013, they figured that they were able to prove it in research. In Forgas's 2011 study, they showed that biased blind spots are not reduced by increased intelligence. So just because you've been through school and you may be smarter or better educated does not remove a blind spot. They're still there for all of us, and we should be aware of them. Everyone's heard the golden rule, which is, well, many people often think that the most respectful and welcoming treatment is what they would like to receive themselves. But I want to introduce to you the idea of the platinum rule. The platinum rule is to treat others the way they want to be treated. And how do you know how they want to be treated? Well, we ask. Now, I'd like to continue with Psychosis 101, some basic terms and some definitions. What is psychosis? Psychosis is a set of symptoms such as auditory or visual hallucinations, delusional thoughts, and or disorganized speech or behavior resulting in the loss of the ability to tell what's real from what's not. So let's go into a little bit more detail. What is a hallucination? A sensory experience perception of something that's not present. I want you to think about that for a minute. Think about the five senses. Hallucinations can be visual, what you see that others don't. They could be auditory, what you hear that others may not be hearing. They can be tactile, what you touch or what you feel on your skin that others may not see. It could be taste related or even smells. How things taste may differ, or how things smell. An example of this would be a person that came in who was dealing with grief. And that individual had dealt with all of the grief in many different areas, but the complaint that they had on a regular basis was they kept smelling things burning. And after a lot of therapy that was done, they determined that that smell of burning came from when their spouse was cremated. Afterwards, they were no longer bothered by that hallucination. When they actually had that hallucination, they felt comfort feeling like their wife was near them. And so we were able to help them with that. By the way, anything that I share, I have permission to share from individuals that I'm sharing it about. Let's talk about what a delusion is. A delusion is a belief or an idea that is firmly maintained despite the reality or the rationality of it. So an example would be if you believe that your doctor was trying to poison you by prescribing a medication. Most of us know the doctors are out to help us and that they're not trying to poison us. However, sometimes people think that that's the case. And so we want to be careful. An example of a delusion that was really, really important to me to understand was a youth that I worked with. This particular person indicated that they thought that their mother was trying to poison them. They were very excited when they went off to college because they were going to get away from that danger. And then their very best friend was who they were rooming with in college, and they began to think that their roommate was beginning to poison them. That was the first time they realized that they might want to research out and get some help. And so I think that delusions are something that are important for us to understand, that the individual may not recognize that that is irrational belief until later. Let's talk for a minute about nature versus nurture. Schizophrenia occurs in less than 1% of the general population, but in 10% of those with a parent or sibling with the disorder. People with cousins, aunts, uncles, or grandparents with a diagnosis have an increased risk that is greater than the general population. The risk of developing schizophrenia increases to 40 to 65% for an identical twin of a person that's diagnosed with schizophrenia. But to me, that's really interesting because that also means that just because an identical twin has the diagnosis of schizophrenia does not mean that the other one is necessarily going to have that diagnosis. Data also suggests that schizophrenia is neither completely environmental nor biological. This gives us great reason to be excited because we have the opportunity to both intervene in lives and to improve them. Now I want to talk about early onset psychosis. Early onset psychosis is the presentation of an episode of psychosis prior to the age of 18. The first episode of psychosis is a point an individual develops a diagnosable level of psychosis. The key word there is diagnosable. Prodrome is early signs and symptoms that can include cognitive, sensory, affect, which is what you look like and your facial expressions, and low-level or intermittent psychotic symptoms. And this time period can be 5 years or longer in duration. The initial focus of our early intervention efforts was getting help to those in the first episode of psychosis. However, in the last 20 years, that focus has shifted to identifying individuals that are in the prodromal stage. The focus of our initiative that I was telling you about in the beginning of this webinar is to actually screen even earlier before the prodromal stage, identifying and intervening with youth in an attempt to prevent psychosis, to improve their outcomes, or to diminish the impact of psychosis altogether. In the absence of illness, remember that's diagnosis, psychotic symptoms are often referred to as psychotic-like experiences, or PLEs. Adolescents who report PLEs at age 11 are at a 5 to 16 times increased risk for developing a psychotic diagnosis or disorder by the age of 26. And self-reported auditory hallucinations at 14 predicted higher rates of psychosis in adulthood. Youth may never go on to develop a full diagnosis within our grant. However, symptoms, if left untreated, do seem to have major impact on their life outcomes. And so recognizing this earlier and earlier, we wanted to make sure that they were getting help earlier. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does this matter? And the first part of that is personal impact. Suicide is the #1 cause of premature death. 40% of those who have been given a diagnosis of schizophrenia attempt once or more in their lifetime, with 10 to 13% of them succeeding. Early identification and intervention improves the lives, the functioning, and the life trajectory of at-risk youth. So the key stands, the earlier the intervention, the better the long-term outcomes, because there's fewer missing skills. We know that adults who develop psychotic disorders often experience symptoms in their youth that were suggestive of increased risk for psychosis, and that's how we knew about the prodromal stage. But how does this impact our society? Societal impact is that $155.7 billion were spent in 2013 in excess healthcare costs, non-healthcare costs, and indirect costs because they were not able to function in society to the level they wanted to, or that society would hope for them. This is also important because we know that 20% of youth live with a mental health condition. 50% of all lifetime cases of a mental illness began by age 14, which is why we need to begin researching earlier. Now, we've talked a lot about schizophrenia, but schizophrenia is not the only reason a client may have a psychotic-like experience or a PLE. Comorbidity is super, super concerning. Comorbidity that can create PLEs include high levels of stress, depression, anxiety, autism spectrum disorder, complex trauma, sleep disturbances or disorders, and substance use, including caffeine with moderate or severe use. I'd like to talk about that for just a minute. Sleep disturbances and disorders are something that not everyone's aware of, but what we know and what sleep doctors have begun telling us is that there is a 60% decrease in anxiety and a 40% decrease in depression when sleep is managed. And so we really want to be aware of whether someone not only is getting enough sleep, but whether they're getting good sleep. And monitoring that with an individual is super, super important. The other thing that I wanted to point out is substance use, including caffeine. This was super important. I had a really, really darling 9-year-old that came into my office one day, and they were experiencing hallucinations of hearing voices before they went to bed. But when they came into my office, the interesting thing was they were carrying a Monster with them. 9-year-olds drinking Monster. That was pretty interesting to me. But I didn't think too much about it until the second time they came in carrying a Starbucks coffee. Then I began to put things together and realized they were only hearing hallucinations or auditory hallucinations at night. I began to ask, how much caffeine are you intaking? It was interesting enough, the youth said, 3 or 4 a day. I was like, 3 or 4 Monsters a day? Yeah, 3 or 4 Monsters and, like coffee and tea. And I was like, oh. So we began to look at that caffeine intake and began to monitor that. This individual really, really wanted to get well, and they had a very healthy family situation, and they were able to help monitor that. And as they decreased the caffeine intake, what we noticed is that the sleep disturbances began to go away, and so did the auditory hallucinations. That, for me, was one of my very first experiences where I was like, oh, what we put into our body is super, super important. The newest studies and things that I want you to keep aware of if you have interest in this area of substance use is marijuana. As marijuana has become more and more legal in more states, they are beginning to bring in research. And what we know is that the substance use of marijuana significantly increases the risk of having hallucinations and different portions of psychosis. And the concern with this is we don't understand all of the impact that has. Sometimes when the substance use has stopped, those symptoms are going away. Sometimes those symptoms just don't get more severe. And that is really interesting research. And so I would encourage you, if you have an interest in this topic, to pay attention to the new research that's coming out about that. I want to talk about different phases of psychosis. Specifically, there's at-risk mental state and ultra-high risk. There's also acute psychosis, early recovery, late recovery, ongoing remission, or incomplete recovery. But our biggest focus, at least for the purpose of this webinar, is at-risk mental state and ultra-high risk. I'm sure you're asking yourself about now, Sherry, you've mentioned that multiple times, but what does that mean? So we're going to talk about it. The at-risk mental state is often referred to as the prodromal phase. Prodromal is that retroactive concept. It's actually only appropriate for someone that's already diagnosed with psychosis. So we only recognize it when we're looking back at something, and then we're like, oh, those signs and symptoms, that was your prodromal phase. So actually, if someone doesn't have a diagnosis yet, but they're experiencing PLEs, an at-risk mental state is a more appropriate term. At-risk or ultra-high risk is not linked with a diagnosis. Most people in this phase will never go on to develop symptoms beyond this point. However, their symptoms can become chronic. We don't want them to have their life interrupted any more than necessary, so early identification and skill building is super important. At-risk mental state characteristics are changes in mood disturbance, increased anxiety, presence of PLEs, those psychotic-like experiences that we were mentioning, sustained loss of functioning or decline in functioning from their baseline. Baseline is where they started before they noticed that there was anything going on. Presence of subthreshold psychotic symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, suspiciousness, occasional auditory hallucinations or episodes of suspiciousness beyond normal reasoning would be some examples of those psychotic-like symptoms and how things might change. Specifically, how things might change from their baseline would include cognitive symptoms such as olfaction, which is smell, working memory, information processing speeds, sensory changes in the way that they look or the way that they are perceived, and low-level or intermittent symptoms of psychosis. And that is important to recognize that they don't always or consistently have to have psychosis symptoms. Sometimes it's just changes and things like maybe they were an A student and they go in and become a C student, so a decline in their grades in school is something to be aware of. Maybe you had a client or a youth that you're working with, or a family member even, and that person used to love going to school or love going out, and all of a sudden their attendance changes. Maybe they drop out of school completely, or they stop being active in different experiences and things that they were doing, like after school activities. Those are all warning signs that we want to be aware of. Those are early symptoms of an at-risk mental state. And it may not be psychosis, but it's something to begin to realize that maybe somebody needs some help. Some other things to pay attention to would be changes in someone's sleep, or major changes in their hygiene. If you had somebody who was always, really, really clean, and all of a sudden they started having poor hygiene, we would want to pay attention to that. Including, and one of the first places we recognize is brushing their teeth, actually. So I thought that was pretty interesting in our research. At-risk mental state common signs and symptoms include increased difficulty at school or work, withdrawal from family or friends. That one can be a tough one because we know teenagers sometimes like to withdraw from everyone. And at the same time, I think the key word there is maybe if you're seeing them withdraw from their friends where they've always been really socially engaged. We want to make sure we're paying attention to that. Difficulty concentrating or thinking clearly, suspiciousness or mistrust of others. And that goes beyond the normal. I think sometimes youth have some mistrust, specifically of adults around them, but when they begin, or even mistrust sometimes of youth, but when it becomes that they're just suspicious or mistrustful of everyone, we really want to make sure we're aware of that. And we might want to help research what resources might be available to them in their area. If they are beginning to talk about there are changes in the way things look or sound to them, things being brighter or duller or louder, all of a sudden they're not handling noise very well, you might want to pay attention to that. It's definitely a sign that stress is something that they're dealing with, and we want to find out what's causing that stress and how we might be able to help reduce it. Because remember, high levels of stress is something that can actually bring on symptoms of PLEs. Also, we want to recognize any odd thinking or behavior, any emotional outbursts that are out of the norm for them. We talked about personal hygiene previously, so we want to just kind of be aware of those things and those changes. That's actually an individual, a young person's cry for help. So then I want to talk about the next stage of psychosis, which is an ultra high risk stage. And I want to talk about screening individuals for that. UHR is what we refer to as ultra high risk. It's determined based on clinical risk factors that include someone's functional decline and also those prodromal symptoms. And those prodromal symptoms, while we wouldn't actually know that they were, and we wouldn't call them prodromal symptoms yet, those would be our PLEs. So we're looking the fact that their function is declining, as well as the fact that they may begin to have intermittent moments where they're having PLEs. And that would be delusions or hallucinations, or bizarre ideas or thoughts. Different ways that we would look at that is the PQB. The PQB is the prodromal questionnaire brief version. It is actually a self-report questionnaire that has been normed for children and youth as young as 12. I mentioned that our grant actually works with youth as young as 9. We're pretty particular. They have to have a family member that has a diagnosis of that. So that's that first generation genetic predisposition we were talking about. But we really work and focus very heavily on those that are 12 through 18 because we're able to use this questionnaire to provide some research-based assistance. Now with that PQB, if a client scores 7 or more on the number of yes responses that they self-report, and they have a distress score of 24 or more, we're actually going to refer them then to someone to actually have further testing done because that triggers us that there's something more going on that we need to kind of assess. To be able to be diagnosed as ultra high risk, that is actually a diagnosis, and well, it's not a DSM-5 diagnosis, but it is an assessment based off of the CARMS that is done and that actually has to be performed. That is not a self-assessment. The CARMS is actually provided to an individual by a licensed clinical professional. So a therapist or psychiatrist could provide that CARMS screening for the individual. But that's the only way that somebody could actually be determined to be in ultra high risk of developing psychosis. And we definitely want to be watchful in those circumstances and make sure we're getting them the help that they need to reduce their stress. The CARMS is designed to pick up on mild symptoms. And so in the CARMS, we're looking at unusual thought content, non-bizarre ideas, perceptual abnormalities, disorganized speech. We're paying attention to the frequency and the duration of symptoms and the level of distress and the pattern of symptoms in the CARMS when we're looking at them. And so we are asking tons and tons of questions. We are asking how often it's happening. We're asking how intense is it, and does it bother you? Because if it doesn't bother them, then it's not disrupting their life. And if it's not disrupting their life, we're less likely to need to provide as many interventions. We only want to provide help if it's something that's disrupting their life. Assessing youth for ultra high risk, we especially want to make aware of unusual experiences, hearing things that others don't hear, for example, seeing things that others don't see, changes in the way the individual thinks. I want to point out that delusions are really rare in individuals under 12 years of age. However, they do occur. For an example, feeling like people are watching or talking about an individual more than usual. This goes beyond the idea that peers are talking about you. For example, it would include clear paranoia that is unresolved with thinking through things or fact-checking with somebody. So an example would be, how do you know an individual is talking about you? And a youth would say back to you, they were whispering and looking at me. And you might ask, could they have been whispering or talking about something good or something else? And the youth would respond to you, no, I know that they were talking bad about me. And you would respond, well, maybe they thought that you were cute and they were just kind of talking about that. And they're like, no, I know they were talking bad about me. And then you would say to the youth, well, did you hear them? So how do you know? And they're like, no, I just know they were. And so that's kind of that thought process, an example of that thought process that doesn't quite make sense, it's not quite rational, but they really, truly believe it. And in that scenario, we wouldn't want to argue with that individual. That is their reality, and that is their perception of what's really happening. And so we are fact-checking with them. We're checking in to make sure things are going well, but we want to be aware and validate that for them this is very, very real. It also could include things like just paranoia. Something that I really encourage is if a youth comes to you in some fashion and says, I'm being bullied at school, and you're talking to professionals and they are saying there's nothing going on, there's nothing, they get along great with their peers, all the teachers really like them, but the youth is consistently reporting they don't feel comfortable, that may be them reaching out to you, telling you that there's something more going on. Early intervention and treatment is what I like to focus on next. The focus of intervention and treatment should be one of our main goals. Again, we talked about earlier intervention equaling better long-term outcomes for individuals. So the main goal should be helping them and their families return to meaningful lives. Remember, youth don't occur outside of family systems, and so we want to make sure they have the very best resources wrapped around them. We want to provide early intervention, as we've talked about multiple times. That's really critical. And we provide the better the prognosis of restoring typical development and functioning, the earlier they receive assistance. And so research indicates that long-term outcome is based on when and how long development is interrupted. Early intervention is super critical. We want to make sure that we recognize any skills that they may have missed in development prior to coming into treatment. And so we want to make sure that we recognize when those symptoms began as well. It makes sense that the longer development is interrupted, the worse the long-term outcome, because as humans, we're creatures of habit. So the longer a behavior lasts, the more difficult it is to extinguish. It's also okay to ask. It's actually important to ask about what somebody's experiencing. Many youth have reported to us in our grant specifically that they recognized that something was not quite right a long time before their symptoms were recognized by others or before they were even able to tell people. So we want to be aware of that, and we want to ask. Don't be afraid to ask about unusual experiences. Don't be afraid to ask for more information. Early intervention goals for us in particular have been improved overall senses of well-being, increased number of days in school, decreased crime and juvenile justice involvement, increased social connectedness, improved coping skills, decreased substance use, increased competitive employment, housing stability for families, and strengthened support and engagement activities for families. What we have been able to gather so far in our data specifically is that by providing the specific services we are providing to these youth, there's a 15% increase in parents reporting that a child is doing better in school. There's a 23% decrease in youth reporting problems with either their school, their work, or job. And also getting along with family members. They report a 36% decrease in parents feeling worried about their family's future, and a 26% decrease in parents reporting disruption in family routines. They also reported a 17% decrease in youth reporting that they didn't understand other people's feelings. And so that statistic is a little bit unclear. Let me explain that a little bit more. Sometimes when they came in, their affect was so closed down that they would say they didn't know what they were feeling or what others were feeling, and that symptom seems to decrease. They have a better understanding of what people around them are experiencing and what they are able to experience and express to others that they're experiencing. There's also been a 26% decrease in youth reporting problems, and this has allowed them to have more fun, and I think that that's really important because a child's job in the world is to learn, and they learn by playing and having fun. When they're experiencing symptoms of psychosis, they're not able to do that. So to me, to have 26% decrease in problems and just being able to enjoy life, that's very, very significant. We want to look at the best care pathway for just a moment. What we know for treating psychosis that's been successful specifically is to look first, use a trauma-informed process and assess any trauma, and do what we can to help if they're open to that treatment. We want to consider genetic predisposition. We want to recognize if they have a family history or something that might be causing psychosis. We also want to be aware of ultra-high risk or at-risk criteria, which we've discussed earlier in our webinar. We want to determine what supports are needed and make sure that we reduce any barriers around them getting assistance. We want to treat trauma, meet the client and the family where they're at, and this cannot be more important. We want to make sure that everybody is receiving the services that they need, but we don't want to we want to pay attention to their culture and make sure that we're meeting them where they are and with what they're ready for. Not everybody's ready to jump right into treatment. We also want to make sure we're using evidence-based modalities. These are just a few: Sparks, EMDR, biofeedback, neurofeedback, case managers, CSSs is what we call them, family support providers, and youth peer supports. Barriers to treatment can include trauma of the individual as well as family members, as well as stigma in the community. No one wants to tell anybody that they have psychosis going on. They don't want to be different, but it's really important for that early treatment. Another issue can be not enough time or energy, and families and parents sometimes struggle with that, they feel overwhelmed. Other mental health issues of the individual or the family members can be a barrier to treatment. Stress survival mode. Sometimes we go into that. There's just so much going on that we just do what we need to survive, and that does not create a situation where we can get further assistance to individuals who are experiencing psychosis. Also, multiple appointments, multiple agencies being involved, an inability to prioritize with flexibility. They don't know what's coming first, and that kind of goes back to that stress survival mode that we were talking about a minute ago. And then the last one is just a lack of information or understanding that this is not a forever situation, that there's hope, that they can get better, and that the more things that are wrapped around them and the sooner they're wrapped around them, the better the outcome. Family support providers and youth peer supports are amazing helpers in providing the very best services for this population. They're structured one-to-one, strength-based relationships provided to the youth or the guardian, hopefully both at the same time, by someone who's dealing with lived experience. They have experience in what that individual's dealing with, and they are able to provide hope because they can share with them that not only are they a support system there for them, but they have been able to deal with it themselves, and they've been successful at doing so, and they're leading successful lives. They can help overcome barriers. They provide services in any setting where the youth or the individual resides. They can increase the family and youth resiliency through education and skill building. They can help family or youth learn the skills necessary to self-advocate and to have a voice. The individuals who deal with psychosis are amazing individuals that are super, super intelligent. They can help family build natural supports in their community so that they are not isolated. A lot of times when we're just going into that stress survival mode, we end up isolating ourselves as individuals from everybody around us. They help people know that they're not alone. They help them know recovery is possible. They help them reclaim the ability to advocate for themselves and establish strength-based supports, and help them reconnect with the community, which is super important. The best practice model is a strength-based approach with supports for the client and the family. We want to focus on stress, vulnerability of recovery. Again, stress is super important for us to work on. So we want to work on stressors. We really want to pay attention to the family dynamics and the family system and how they're interacting with each other. We want to make sure that we don't neglect vocation and educational goals. We want to help them make sure that they're meeting their goals where they're at with what they desire to do in life, and we want to be aware of any substance use for self-medicating purposes. We want to make sure that they understand the dangers around those things and that we're observant. We want to work with the individual and a family to improve resiliency in their social functioning, their family dynamics, and skill building. A strength-based approach should be targeted to help an individual and a family maintain hope above all else and understand that recovery happens every day. We also want to increase resiliency skills, help them manage stress, identify support networks, and understand basic symptoms. We want to provide information and resources, and we want to help them know when they need to reach out for help. So at this point, I would be open to taking any questions that you guys have. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to figure out how to open up these questions. Give me just a second. Okay, it looks like at this time that there aren't any questions, so I appreciate your time, and I hope you guys have an amazing day.